I'm recording now. Hello, welcome. I'm John with Broadsheet.ie, and you're very welcome to Tomorrow Tonight. We're joined by Dan Boyle, Green Party Councillor on Cork City Council. Good evening, Dan.
Good evening, John. How are you doing?
Very well. Can we crack straight into the papers?
Sure.
Good. Okay. Firstly, I just want to say that Dan's column, by the way, is on the site today, this morning, and it is concerns our President Biden. Here it is. Time for an Ordinary Joe, which is from the article itself. You argue that it won't be a Camelot, but it's a relief now. The US needs to take a deep breath, maybe even go into hibernation. Maybe we'll talk about that once we've done the papers.
Sure.
That's
yeah,
okay.
The papers are the real issue at the moment in any case.
Well, yeah. I mean, okay, so here we are. Your local paper, The Examiner, has a number of good stories on the cover. Level 5 onto March, Cabinet admits far-right protesters harassed Dublin Lord Mayor. The call for park name change following the report on the homes, and Garda examining contract leak claims. Anything there, Dan?
I think the park name change is something that is coming through my colleagues on Cork City Council. I know we've talked about that, and not only the park, but there's a pedestrian bridge over the Southern Ring Road next to the Bessborough site that's called Sacred Heart, and in honour of the Sacred Heart Convent. I think it's to open a debate about the fact that those who have been associated with events at Bessborough, the notorious, infamous Bessborough, should not be acknowledged in a way that the city has chosen to do so. I think there's also the case that health, the administration of health, up until the formation of the health boards in 1970, which was the pre-runner of the HSE, was done through local authorities and local councils. So the council would have had direct administrative responsibility for Bessborough during its most notorious time, and the need to confront that past along with many of the survivors and their histories, and to at a local government level come up with ways of acknowledging that and coming up with civic apologies and ways of trying to make sure that the hurt that was caused can be somewhat acknowledged. Part of that is how we acknowledge the history, and part of that is how we choose to honour those who lived through that. And their choices we've got very badly wrong in the past, and I'm anticipating a bit of debate as to how we should be doing this in the future.
What about the proposed development at Bessborough? The proposed housing development?
Yeah, being Ireland, we can make that as complicated as we like. There are two applications. One which has gone directly to Board Pleanála, and one which was being dealt with by Cork City Council. The strategic housing development, which is still in place, which will probably fade out sometime in 2021, allows developers to go directly to Board Pleanála for housing developments that have more than 100 units in it. But the council can give its observations, and the elected members have, and we're in the process of doing that. The chief executive is doing a report. We've had internal meetings, and I think it's fair to say it's a 31-member council. There isn't a sitting member who wants the development to proceed, please can, because it's a graveyard. Bessborough is a graveyard site. We don't know how many are buried. We don't know where they're buried. And the idea of developing in any way without knowing that and acknowledging that is not something other than by the developer himself. Is something that I think is supported by anyone in the political system or in the planning.
No, that's good. That's really good to hear. Talking about the site, it does seem that the development, well, the proposed development was adjoining what seems to be the burial place for the.
And the fact that it's a seams is part of the problem, because
Yeah.
There's no direct knowledge of how many are buried and where. There's an assumption that part of the grounds is where there are a number of bodies of children buried, but it's never been excavated, and we know how many have died. We don't know where they were put subsequently. And some of them, the Examiner would have had a story in yesterday's edition about 700 of those deaths would have occurred before 1947. And there was an attrition rate, which is a horrible word to use, of during that time period of something like 70% of the children during some time in the 1940s. And there was an attempt to have an official investigation then that was stopped because apparently the papal nuncio paid a visit to Eamon de Valera, who was Taoiseach at the time. And right. That was the Ireland we lived in then, and that's what you're trying to come to terms with.
Yeah, you wrote a very powerful piece last week concerning somebody who was very close to you, who had been born in Besborough.
My former wife, mother of my child, and her lack of history reflects my daughter's lack of history and her children's lack of history, and it's a big lacuna in our family's history. So it's her need for information is also our need for information, and there are thousands of others in the country in a similar situation.
Yeah. Let's move on. There's so much to talk about that. In fact, I was asked, we were asked on the site to ask you concerning Roderick O'Gorman and his role in I don't know. I suppose at the moment supporting the report or complementing the report and going to take on its recommendations.
Well, the report isn't ideal. Roderick O'Gorman as Minister, he's inherited both the Commission and its report, and I'm confident he'll respond to it appropriately. Dealing with the legislation just to make sure that its records were kept was a difficult situation for him a number of weeks ago. But he is committed to bringing in the legislation this year and consulting properly to make sure that happens. There will be a few private members' bills. Labour Party has a bill down and Sinn Féin have a bill down. They will seek to have that done immediately. I'm not too sure how that's going to be responded to, but I suspect there's need for some work to make sure that the legal niceties are properly put into any piece of legislation. And if it happens this year, that'll be great. And I think that's the timetable that's likely to happen.
Okay. It's not a lose-lose, but I mean, this is it's a real poison chalice. I mean, Catherine Zappone did nothing. Well, so delayed it till she left, and then now.
Yes, of course, it's something that that Roderick, I think, as a minister, is finding very difficult to deal with. But I think he's coming around to. He fully admitted himself that his first approach was not done in terms of proper prior consultation, and he's made a lot of effort to do that subsequently.
Yeah.
And I know he did talk directly with a lot of representatives groups, and there was a webinar before the report was released outside of that leak on the Sunday Independent 2 days before that, which is something he was very annoyed about. But the nature of government is that things get leaked, and people do so for often the most perverse reasons. But I think he's starting to win back the trust of the survivor groups, and there's a belief that his commitment will be to deliver the legislation that's necessary to, at the very least, give people the right to their personal information that's been denied for so long.
Yeah. Do you think this is very damaging to the Green Party?
Look, anything in government, well, being in government itself is something that you put yourself up for being assessed and being critically thought about. And anything that courts public controversy is going to be represented either in the media or by the political opposition in ways that you're going to find it difficult to counter. And you're going to suffer political hits as a result of that. But you know that before going into government, or at least you should. There are situations where that as a party, more people feel comfortable, our members and some of our elected members feel we'd be more comfortable in opposition. But the majority of the party on a regular basis have said that this is something we can do, we need to do, that we can, if we choose to do so. Part of that journey is going to be that there are going to be negative things that we're going to have to counter here and there.
Yeah, I would think that just the concern is whether Fianna Boyle are acting and Fine Gael are acting in good faith. And
well, yeah, that is a concern, and in the sense that it's their own histories that are more under the spotlight.
But that's the fig leaf. I mean, that Minister Gorman is basically like Sapone was. Kind of playing.
Well, I don't think it's as cynical as that. I mean, I think Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have histories to be embarrassed about. They can't change that history. The successive governments is the history of the state.
The last two ministers dealing with this are from without any history whatsoever, and they seem to be used almost in a way to deflect any kind of real criticisms. I thought Catherine Sapone got away with a lot of delay and obfuscation and weirdness, particularly regarding the Pope and the letter and the curtsy in front of it and all this sort of oddness. But it seems Sapone, and I think Mr. Gorman, has been used as a kind of to deflect from those who really are responsible.
I don't know if you, but I can accept it. Yeah, to some extent, the price of being in government is to deal with a difficult situation that the traditional parties have chosen not to, because it reflects worse on them than it does on other people. Then that's a consequence of the situation. But I think historically it's going to be looked in a different context. I mean, the fact is that successive governments were the people who chose not to act upon what was known to be abuses of young women and children. And that's what our history is going to read like in years to come.
Sorry for taking up the time. That is actually a Green Party motion, isn't it? The changing the Bishop Lucy Park.
It's the Green Group in Cork City Council, and changed the name of the bridge. And the Bishop Lucy Park is a bigger thing, but the reference in the report to Bishop Lucy. Of now Bishop Lucy Park fame is that he forced the order, or he told the order that they had to keep the home open when they wanted to close it in the 1970s. So it had an unnatural life of a further 20 years on his insistence.
Okay.
It's not a situation that existed in Dublin a number of years ago, where Merrion Park had been called Archbishop Ryan Park, and subsequently its name was changed. Okay. So I think we're going to have a similar debate in Cork.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Lucy, but not as well as, say, McQuaid, but he was a figure like McQuaid, wasn't he, in Cork?
Well, I suppose he wasn't as austere as McQuaid, but in
30 years of...
Yeah, well, he was seen as an intellectual heavyweight in the Irish hierarchy and things like that, and... He was probably the last of a traditional bishops whose word had to be taken and accepted. When the Catholic Church rode large on civic life, and after him, it started to recede a bit.
Yeah, and I believe you want to remove the prayer. Is that right? From the
well, that's not part of the letter we sent to the motion.
Okay. Sorry, no, it was mentioned.
Yeah, but it is probably referenced in the letter we sent to the whips is strictly about Besborough and how we can properly acknowledge the survivors.
Okay. Well, we'll just get on here. Oh, by the way, sorry, the mullet is.
Yeah, that's because I washed my hair, John. My hair grows up rather than down.
The level 5.
At least it's still going.
Anyway, and midlife sex and melting pot. Very all for men of a certain age. This examiner tomorrow. Gregor, I've been cleared. You don't say anything about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I must admit, I'm very ambivalent about Mr. McGregor. Whatever legal situation exists is a legal situation, but that he's a man of lesser character, I think, is becoming more and more apparent. I saw he was boasting about he has a million euro watch that he wears now, apparently, and I just saw that and I thought, the man wears 4 houses on his hand. You know, we're supposed to be impressed.
Okay, the
sure,
Echo,
he doesn't throw it in a punch, though.
No, indeed, the Echo, another local COVID stark warning: Holland work with us to beat the virus. More than 500 COVID-related deaths have been reported in Ireland so far this month.
Well, yeah, the rate of increase to the post-Christmas hangover has seen us maybe have half as many cases as we would have had in the 9 months before that, and a significant rise in the number of deaths. We're about 20% of the deaths, I think, now would have occurred in the month of January alone, and we had been reducing those up until Christmas and the decisions that related to that. The fear is that the English variant now seems to be the more predominant strain. So because it's more transmissible, it means the need to keep things closed down is probably more. But while the ICU beds continue to fill and the number of deaths are increasing, the rate of transmission is reducing and the number of new cases are reducing. So if we're doing things right, and it's very movable feast, we might be seeing a change of this within 2 weeks. But I think it'll be a very long tail to get us back to where we would have been in the middle of December.
The London Times, £500 sterling for catching COVID under plan to slow virus. This is everyone in England who tests positive for coronavirus could be given 500 to ensure they self-isolate under plans to stop hardship spreading the virus. Okay. Would you be...
Yeah, well,
okay.
it's a strange situation because we've had a difficult 2 weeks, and our figures have gone off the charts for the 2 week period as they've ballooned after Christmas. But our 12-month figures in international terms are kind of middle of the road. For instance, the rate per million, deaths per million from COVID are higher in Germany than they are in Ireland, and they remain so. Whereas our comparison to Britain Britain would still be about 2.5 times higher the rate of deaths than we have, and Britain is the worst country of countries of a particular population, countries over 20 million in size.
Would you approve of this payment? I mean, would you approve for it to be introduced into Ireland? It's a universal. It sounds like a universal basic income to the back door.
Our situation is we have the PUP payment, and we've had several extensions of that, and the PUP payment is higher than the rate of unemployment for most people.
It's not related to actually testing positive or anything like that. Do you think that?
No, it's not. No, but it's. I'm not too sure whether the situation can be complicated even further by having different rates of payments for different situations. Yeah. I think there are other forms of encouragement people can be offered, and maybe they can be considered. Okay. It's just that I think the government's approach is as contentious as the Irish government's approach has been, and as validly open to criticism has been, but the British government's response has been far worse and one of the worst in the world. And I don't think there's many lessons we can learn from them about how we might approach this, to be honest.
Okay. This is about the BBC, but I was wondering, have you seen the pay rates for our RT's top stars yet? Top stars.
Yeah. I suppose what surprised me was that there was meant to be a situation where they were supposed to be reducing over the years, but the figures from 2017 showed mild increases for all of them. So that you're talking about 450, 475 for the first 3 or 4 people, and for about a dozen, maybe 15 people, rates between 200,000 and 450. We're a small country. The media market is also quite small. It's hard to know where the comparative salaries are coming from. The argument has been made in the past that the bigger fish in the RT pool might have made themselves available to British media companies, and there was always the opportunity of getting work there. Citing Terry Wogan or Gay Byrne in his early and things like that. I think that's never been the case, but it's always been the RT that this is why they had to justify the higher wages. I suppose contracts are contracts. It's hard to get out of them. What RT needs to do is have a culture of making sure that whoever follows, and there will be a large replacement of many of these people in the next few years, that the new rates of pay are more realistic and have to do with the nature of the work that's done. And the problem is that because Virgin Media is a private company, and the O'Brien radio stations, Communicore radio stations are private companies, we don't know what the comparative rates of pay are. We suspect they're small. We don't know.
An absolute fraction of what those guys have been paid.
Yeah.
I think Pat Kenny would presumably be the most highly paid of the independent people, but there's such multiples of what other people have been paid. It literally is stunning. And I often feel when these guys going into work, in the car park and stuff, and they're walking by people who they're earning 30, 40 times as much. It's just, but it's also state on, and I've often felt like they.
I find it difficult to justify wages of, say, the proposed wages for new secretary generals in the Department of Health, or even the head of the HSE themselves. But even those rates of pay are lower than the higher rates of pay in RT. So what are we comparing people to? I mean, in terms of the responsibility, in terms of the stress of the job, in terms of the need to deliver, they're two different realities.
It's a different. We could have a really long chat about it. I mean, and they all seem to have the same agent.
Which we get you 10% of all those. My gosh.
I know. Well, monopolies love monopolies. I guess that's the key there.
Well, and the thing is, they are all agents. They're not employees. They tend not to be employees. So they are all companies, and they're taxed as companies, not as individuals. So there's so many levels in which they operate that doesn't reflect the reality of how most workers get paid and contribute to the state. It is to far more scrutiny, I think.
Well, I speak as somebody who hasn't had a great 10 years, and I look at that kind of money, and you really just go, oh, wow. Morning after in America, The Economist, he's gonna mop up the orange.
Mop and doom, yeah. It's well, apparently, I think it's probably a bit of political propaganda, but the Democrats were making, and the Biden people were making a lot of noise about how the White House had to be especially deep cleaned because of the corruptions that happened there and things like that. I suspected it would have had to be deep cleaned whoever was changing power at any time, but it's
I got to say,
it's what Trump does next.
It's not really Biden mania. I mean, I don't get this sort of Kennedy-esque.
That's what I was trying to get across. So I think to be the anti-Trump, to succeed in the election and to follow as a president, he really needs to be the opposite of everything that Trump has been. He has to be low volume. He has to show empathy, where whatever Trump didn't have, Biden as president has to have the opposite quality, I think, if he wants to succeed. So he won't be bragging. He will be listening. He will be empathetic. He'll take different policy approaches. But the problems in
he may sleep long. He may have long siestas, perhaps, but it's his age.
Well, Reagan had those. Ronald Reagan was notorious for those.
He remains one of the most popular. This is the Star.
Gavin
all these British politicians look the same.
Yes.
So this is
well, that's one of the criticisms about Boris Johnson and the Tory government, in the sense that that it's a cabinet largely of yes men, and they're there not because of any particular ability they have, and it's probably the least talented, most incompetent government of recent times, and that's saying something.
Well,
but
yeah, I mean, the cabinet, they do look like, all of the cabinet look like people who were bullied by Boris back in school or something. You know, they have that sort of, you know,
there's a touch of that, I think. Yeah,
it really is. I mean, it's beginning to look like the kind of the Beano idea of toffs, you know, at the top at this stage. They're running. I mean, I think the talent pool is thinning, and they're bringing in like guys who really, you know, guys who don't look very well.
And
everything else.
And it doesn't say a lot for the quality of education in their public schools either, and in terms of the ability of these people or their ability to rationalize or to strategize. They seem to be very. This is also true of the civil servants. That part of the exercise that Dominic Cummings was engaged in, I think, was to try to make sure that key people in the civil service were moved on and that they were replaced by people who thought like us. And that's the danger of trying to having a melange government, that it's all about the right way of thinking rather than having a more democratic way of having yourself open to criticism, accountability, and giving yourself the ability to change, which these stories totally.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, the lesson of the last 2 weeks is that the permanent government, I mean, the Irish civil service is still very, very extremely embedded with the Catholic Church, really. I mean, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean,
well, I think there are particular government departments that would be true of, but less so. As you know, generations change, those links have changed. But I would have seen it in the past where.
Yeah. You would have thought, I would have thought, but I was really shocked at the report. I mean, of what I can kind of gather, it's so difficult to follow the report, funnily enough. But
it's very legalese, and it does pull punches, and it presents.
It feels like something from the 90s, you know, the early 90s. You know.
Yeah, it does. Well, my understanding of it is that it's less an attempt to obscure, but to have levels of evidence that are required in a court case. And I think they went beyond their remit in that case, because it's really obvious to everyone familiar with the history of these institutions what happened. And the fact that the Commission in its report felt unable to say so many of those things discredits the report itself. That's why I think Roderick O'Gorman is going to have to act not only on what the report itself was recommending, but he's going to have to recommend what the Commission itself didn't recommend because it was pulling too many punches. You know, the legislation, the eventual redress schemes has to go over and beyond what this report is saying, because the report itself is so inadequate.
Yeah, well, if he does go in that direction, he certainly has the people behind him. I think the majority of people, there's been an outcry. Dan, we always chat too long. Thank you so much.
It's no problem. My pleasure.
We'll see you next week. Thank you. Thank
you. See you
much.
soon. Good luck.
And your column today is on the site. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Good night.
Talk to you.